I told my wife I'd been let go on a Tuesday morning, and by Friday she had filed for divorce. What she didn't know was that I'd been offered the biggest job in the state of North Carolina 3 days before I said a word. My name is Harold Meeks. I'm 65 years old. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a 4-bedroom house on Selwyn Avenue that I bought in 1996 with money I earned building a career no one in my family ever bothered to understand. For 38 years, I was married to a woman named Lorraine. For 31 of those years, I ran logistics operations at Kessler Brandt Distribution, one of the largest supply chain firms in the Southeast. I started as a route coordinator. I retired as vice president of operations. In between, I moved approximately $4 billion worth of freight across 11 states without losing a single major account. That's not a boast. That's a line item on a resume that people who matter have read. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. The leather notebook in my desk drawer has been with me since 1983, the year I finished my service with the U.S. Army. 22 years in logistics and supply chain command across 3 deployments. The Army taught me 2 things that never left. First, that every operation is only as reliable as its documentation. Second, that you never reveal your supply lines to an adversary. I carried that notebook through every promotion, every contract negotiation, every quarterly review for 3 decades. It went with me to board meetings. It went with me to funerals. It held the kind of notes that don't belong in a computer, observations, instincts, things I noticed that didn't have a category yet, but would eventually. In April of last year, the notebook started filling with entries about my own household. Not because I wanted to write them, because I couldn't stop noticing. It started with small things. The way Lorraine's voice changed on the phone when she spoke to her sister Nadine versus when she spoke to me. The way my daughter Celeste, 34, a marketing director at a firm on South Boulevard, had stopped asking me about my work entirely, but always knew my salary to the dollar. The way my son Jerome, 31, living in Raleigh with a job in tech support he'd held for exactly 9 months, only called when he needed something wired to his account. The way Lorraine had started saying "we" when she talked about the house, the savings, the retirement accounts, but "I" when she talked about plans. I am not a paranoid man. I am an observant one. And what I observed, slowly, over the course of about 18 months, was that the people closest to me had stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as infrastructure. The power grid, the plumbing, something that existed to keep the lights on and the water running, and that no one thought about until it stopped working. So I decided to find out what would happen if the power went out. The opportunity arrived in March. I had been recruited, quietly, over a period of 4 months, by the board of Tryon National Group. If you're not from North Carolina, you may not know the name. If you are, you know exactly what it means. Tryon National is the largest privately held company in the state. $2.3 billion in annual revenue. Headquartered in the Tryon Tower on South Tryon Street, 32 floors of glass and Carolina granite. They move freight, manage warehousing, operate distribution networks across the eastern seaboard, and hold contracts with 3 branches of the U.S. military. The previous managing director, a man named Leland Cross, had resigned under pressure 8 months earlier after a procurement scandal that never made the papers but made the boardroom very uncomfortable. The board needed someone with operational credibility, government logistics experience, and the kind of temperament that doesn't flinch when you hand them a $2.3 billion portfolio and say, "Fix it." They found me through a headhunter named Marcus Calloway at Spencer Howell in Atlanta. Marcus had placed me on a short list of 4 candidates. I flew to Atlanta twice, met with the board chair, a woman named Patricia Okafor, in a conference room at the Ritz-Carlton on Peachtree. The second meeting lasted 4 hours. By the end of it, she offered me the position. Managing Director of Tryon National Group. Base compensation of $1.2 million annually, plus equity participation, plus a signing package I won't disclose because it's not relevant to the story. What's relevant is that I signed the offer letter on March 14th. The start date was April 7th. And I told absolutely no one. Not Lorraine. Not Celeste. Not Jerome. Not my neighbor Glenn Driscoll, who had a habit of standing at the end of his driveway and asking questions he had no business asking. Not a single person in my life knew what was coming, because I needed to know something first. I needed to know who would stay if the money disappeared. On the morning of March 18th, for days after signing the try-on offer, I sat down across from Lorraine at the kitchen table on Selwyn Avenue. She was on her phone, scrolling through something, half a grapefruit in front of her. The kitchen smelled like the espresso machine she'd insisted we buy for $2,400 the previous October. The one she used once a day and I had never touched. "Lorraine," I said. She looked up. Not all the way. The kind of half look that says I'm listening, but I'm also doing something more interesting. "I got called into a meeting yesterday with Phil Drucker and the senior leadership team," I said. Phil Drucker was my actual boss at Kessler Brandt, a decent man who had been nothing but supportive of my retirement timeline. "They're restructuring the operations division. My position has been eliminated." I watched her face. This is the part one need you to understand. I watched her face the way I used to watch supply chain dashboards during a crisis, not for what was being said, but for what moved first. What moved first was her jaw. It tightened, not in sympathy, in calculation. The muscles along the side of her face shifted the way they do when someone is already 3 steps ahead of the emotion they're about to perform. "What?" She set the phone down. "When?" "Effective end of month. I'll get a severance package, but the position is gone." She stared at me, not at my face, at a point slightly behind my face, the way people look when they're doing math they don't want you to see. "How much severance?" That was her second question. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What happened?" Not, "We'll figure it out." How much severance? I told her a number. I told her the number was modest, which it would have been if any of this were real. She nodded slowly, already composing the next sentence in her head. "We'll need to look at the budget," she said. "And I think we should talk to Dwight." Dwight Sutton was her attorney. Not our attorney. Hers. A man whose office was on East Boulevard in a building with a lobby fountain and a receptionist who called everyone Hon. I had met him once, at a dinner party 2 years earlier, where he'd spent 20 minutes explaining to me why prenuptial agreements were just good planning, while Lorraine nodded beside him like she was attending a lecture she'd already memorized. I didn't ask why her first instinct was to call a lawyer. I already knew. I had known for 18 months. I had just needed to hear it. I picked up my coffee, took a sip, and said, "Whatever you think is best." She blinked. Something in that answer didn't match the script she'd rehearsed. She was expecting resistance. She was expecting panic. She was expecting the version of Harold who would scramble to reassure her that everything was going to be fine, that the money would keep flowing, that nothing would change. Instead, she got a man drinking coffee with the calm of someone who had already read the last page of the book. She picked up her phone and left the kitchen. I heard her on the stairs, already dialing. I sat at the table and opened my leather notebook. I wrote the date, the time, and 3 words. Test initiated. Tuesday. By Thursday, Lorraine had retained Dwight Sutton formally. I know this because the retainer agreement arrived by email, CC'd to me, with a subject line that read, "Florist Meeks, initial consultation summary." She hadn't even used my last name first. By Friday morning, March 21st, 3 days after I'd told her about the job, Lorraine filed for divorce in Mecklenburg County Superior Court. 3 days. 38 years of marriage, and it took her 72 hours to decide I wasn't worth the trouble. I stood in the kitchen that Friday afternoon and read the filing notification on my phone. The house was quiet. Lorraine was out, probably at Nadine's, probably already dividing the furniture in her head. I set the phone on the counter and looked out the window at the backyard I'd maintained for 28 years, the dogwood I'd planted when Celeste was born, the flagstone path I'd laid myself the summer Jerome learned to ride a bike. I opened the notebook. I wrote, "Filing received." 72 hours. Faster than expected. Then I closed it, put it in my desk drawer, and started making dinner. There was nothing to be upset about. The test had returned exactly the result I'd predicted. The only thing left was to see how far they'd all be willing to go before the answer key was published. The divorce moved fast because Lorraine wanted it to move fast, and I let her believe she was driving. Dwight Sutton sent a proposed settlement framework to my inbox on Monday morning, March 24th. I read it at the kitchen table with a bowl of oatmeal and a glass of orange juice. The document was 11 pages long, formatted with the careful aggression of a man who assumed his opponent had no resources and no fight. It proposed a 60-40th split of all marital assets in Lorraine's favor. It proposed that I vacate the Selwyn Avenue house within 90 days. It proposed spousal support of $3,200 per month for a period of 5 years, indexed to inflation. It proposed that Lorraine retain full ownership of the joint brokerage account at Schwab, which held approximately $340,000. It proposed that I keep my truck, my personal savings account at Wells Fargo, which held $28,000, and my 401k, which after 31 years at Kessler Brandt sat at just over $410,000. In short, Lorraine wanted everything that was easy to spend and was willing to leave me everything that was hard to access. The math was not subtle. She wanted liquid. She wanted now. She wanted to walk away from a 38-year marriage with a check in her hand and no forwarding address. I didn't respond to Sutton's email that day. I didn't respond the next day either. I let it sit, not because I was upset, because I wanted to see what would happen when I didn't react. What happened was Celeste. My daughter called me on Tuesday evening. I was in the study, the room at the back of the house that Lorraine had always called Harold's Cave, with the particular inflection of someone describing a room they considered beneath them. The study had a desk, a reading lamp, the leather chair I'd bought in 2004, and the notebook. It was the only room in the house that felt entirely mine. "Dad," she said when I picked up. Her voice had the tight, efficient quality of someone who had been briefed and was now executing the briefing. "Mom told me about the job. I'm sorry." "Thank you, Celeste." A pause. I could hear Parker in the background. Parker Ainsley, her husband of 3 years, a man who sold commercial insurance and had once asked me at Thanksgiving dinner whether I'd ever considered moving into something with more upside. He was 36 and had never held a job for longer than he'd held a lease. "Listen, Dad," she said, "I think you need to be realistic about the house. Mom's been there for almost 30 years. She has a connection to it. And honestly, at your age, a smaller place might make more sense. Something in South End, maybe, or one of those new developments off Tyvola Road. Parker says the market is strong right now, so you'd get a fair price if you sold quickly." I sat very still. My daughter, my firstborn, the child I had driven to swim practice every Saturday morning for 6 years, the girl whose college tuition I had paid in full, for years at UNC Charlotte, $78,000 all in, was telling me to sell the house I'd bought with my own money and move to an apartment so her mother could have the life she was accustomed to. "I appreciate the input," I said. "Dad, I'm serious. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Mom's already stressed enough." "Your mother filed for divorce 3 days after I told her I lost my job, Celeste. I'm not sure I'm the one making things hard." Silence. "Then, that's not fair. She's been thinking about this for a while. The job thing was just the final straw. The final straw. A 38-year marriage, and losing my income was the straw that broke it." I almost admired the honesty buried inside the excuse. I told her I'd think about Sutton's proposal. I told her I loved her. She said, "Love you too, Dad." The way you'd sign a form letter, and hung up. I wrote it down. All of it. Date, time, duration of call, key quotes. I wrote down what Celeste said about the house. I wrote down the phrase "at your age." I wrote down Parker's name and his suggestion about Tyvola Road. Jerome called the following day, Wednesday, March 26th. The call lasted 4 minutes. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not ask what had happened at Kessler Brandt. He said, "Mom told me what happened. You should have planned better, Dad." Then he asked if I could wire him $800 for a car repair he said was urgent. I told him I'd think about it. He said, "All right. Well, let me know." And that was the last I heard from him for 2 weeks. Plan better. My son, who had never held a position above help desk coordinator, who had borrowed $14,000 from me over the previous 3 years in amounts small enough that he apparently believed I wasn't keeping track, was advising me on financial planning. I wrote down the $800 request. I wrote down "plan better." I did not send the wire. Lorraine, meanwhile, had shifted into a mode I can only describe as operational. She moved through the house like a project manager conducting an inventory. She opened drawers I hadn't seen her open in years. She photographed artwork, furniture, the set of copper pots I'd bought in Asheville on our 20th anniversary. She stood in the garage and looked at my workbench, my tools, the shelving unit I'd built in 2009, and I could see her mentally appraising each item, assigning it a value, filing it in a column marked his or mine. She never asked me how I was doing. Not once. Not in the first week, not in the second. She asked me about the Schwab account. She asked me about the deed to the house. She asked me whether the life insurance policy was still active and who the beneficiary was. She asked these questions the way a claims adjuster asks about water damage, with professional detachment and a clipboard behind her eyes. I answered every question honestly. The Schwab account was joint. The deed was in my name, had been since 1996, and she had never been added to it, an oversight she'd never bothered to correct because she'd never imagined a scenario where it would matter. The life insurance named her as beneficiary. I hadn't changed it. I wasn't going to. That wasn't the kind of man I was. What she didn't ask about was the Tryon National offer letter sitting in the locked drawer of my study desk. What she didn't know was that Marcus Calloway had called me twice that week to finalize onboarding details, that Patricia Okafor had emailed me a welcome note from the board, and that my new office on the 14th floor of the Tryon Tower was being furnished to specifications I'd provided during a phone call I'd taken from the backyard while Lorraine was at Nadine's house planning her post-divorce life. The test was still running. The results were still coming in. And I was writing down every single one. The second week was worse. Not for me. For the version of me that other people had decided existed. On Saturday, March 29th, Lorraine brought Nadine to the house. Nadine Corbin was Lorraine's older sister by 3 years, a woman who had been divorced twice and considered herself an authority on the subject the way someone who has been in 2 car accidents considers themselves a driving expert. She arrived at 10 a.m. in a silver Lexus, carrying a tape measure and a legal pad. They walked through the house together for 2 hours. I was in the study. I could hear them through the door. Nadine's voice carried the way confidence does when it's not backed by anything, loud and directional. "This dining set is worth at least $4,000, she said from the room where I'd eaten breakfast for 28 years. And the credenza in the hall, that's solid walnut. She should get that appraised." Lorraine murmured agreement. "Has he said anything about the 401k? Nadine asked. "Because that's the real number. Everything else is furniture." I wrote it down. I noted the time. I noted that neither of them had knocked on the study door or acknowledged that I was in the house. I was furniture too, apparently, just harder to appraise. On Sunday, Nadine came back. This time she brought a friend, a woman named Diane who apparently had experience in real estate staging. They stood in the living room and discussed how the house would show if it went on the market. Diane suggested repainting the study. "That dark color makes the room feel small," she said. "Buyers want light." They were staging my house while I was sitting in it. I made coffee. I brought a cup to the living room and set it on the table beside Lorraine. "Afternoon," I said. "Can I get anyone anything?" The 3 of them looked at me the way you'd look at a hotel employee who'd wandered into the wrong conference room. Lorraine said, "We're fine, Harold." Nadine didn't say anything. Diane smiled politely and went back to measuring the window for curtains she was already mentally replacing. I returned to the study. I wrote, Sunday. Staging consultation conducted in occupied home. Homeowner not consulted. Monday brought Parker Ainsley. Celeste's husband called me at 1:15 p.m. while I was eating a sandwich at the kitchen counter. I'd been spending my days doing what I always did between positions: reading, walking, maintaining the house. The difference was that now I was also preparing for a role that would put me in charge of the largest private company in the state, reading onboarding materials that arrived by secure email, reviewing organizational charts, studying the last 3 years of Tryon's financial statements. But that happened behind a locked study door. To anyone watching, I was just an old man eating sandwiches alone. Parker opened with what he probably thought was warmth. "Hey, Harold. Celeste wanted me to check in on you." He did not say Dad. He had never called me Dad. I hadn't asked him to, but the omission was consistent enough to be a statement. "I'm doing fine, Parker." Good. Listen, I've been thinking. You know I'm in commercial insurance, right? He waited for confirmation. I gave it. Well, I've got some connections in the warehousing space, last mile delivery, that kind of thing. Entry-level stuff, but it's honest work. Might be a good fit for someone looking to, stay active. Entry-level. The man was offering entry-level warehouse work to a former vice president of operations with 31 years of executive experience and a military logistics background that had managed supply chains across 3 continents. He was offering it the way someone offers a coat to a man they assume is cold, without asking first, and without noticing the man is already wearing one. I appreciate that, Parker. I'll keep it in mind. Sure thing. And Harold? Don't take this the wrong way, but Celeste and I both think you should probably accept Lorraine's terms sooner rather than later. The longer this drags out, the more it costs everyone. You don't want to be the guy who makes this ugly. I thanked him for calling. I hung up. I wrote down entry level and something more your speed. I underlined don't want to be the guy. On Tuesday of the second week, the neighbor happened. Glenn Driscoll lived 2 doors down on Selwyn Avenue. Retired dentist. The kind of man who treated his front yard like a stage and every passing walker like an audience. He stopped me as I was bringing in the mail. Harold, he said, with the careful voice people use when they've already decided you're in trouble. Lorraine mentioned at book club that things were, transitioning for you professionally. Book club. Lorraine had told the neighborhood book club that I'd been fired. She said it was a restructuring. That's tough, man. Especially at this stage. He lowered his voice. She also mentioned there might be some changes at the house. I just want you to know, if you need anything, a recommendation, whatever, I'm here. He said at this stage the way Celeste had said at your age. As though 65 was a diagnosis and not a number. As though a man who had commanded supply logistics for an entire theater of Army operations and then run the distribution network for one of the Southeast's largest companies was now in need of a dentist's letter of recommendation. I thanked Glenn. I shook his hand. I went inside and wrote his name in the notebook. I wrote, book club, and at this stage. I added Glenn to a list that was growing shorter every day, the list of people who would eventually need to explain themselves. The following day, Celeste posted something on Instagram. I don't use Instagram, but I have an account I created years ago at her insistence, and I check it occasionally the way you check a weather report for a city you used to live in. The post was a photo of her and Parker at a restaurant on East Boulevard, the kind of place with small plates and large opinions. The caption read, surrounded by people who show up. That's the only wealth that matters. Some of us learned late that effort isn't inherited. It had 47 likes. Lorraine had hearted it. Nadine had commented, preach. I screenshot the post. I printed it. I put it in the notebook. That night, I sat in the study with the door locked and the reading lamp on. The notebook was open in front of me. I'd filled 11 pages in 2 weeks. Dates, times, quotes, dollar amounts, names. The complete record of a family dismantling its most reliable member because they believed he had stopped being useful. I picked up my phone and opened the email from Patricia Okafor that had arrived that afternoon. The subject line read, Pre-announcement review, managing director appointment. Attached was the draft press release, the Charlotte Business Journal feature copy, and the LinkedIn post that would go live simultaneously from Tryon National's corporate account and from Patricia's personal profile, which had 43,000 followers in the Charlotte business community. The announcement was scheduled for Monday, April 7th, 11 days away. I closed the email. I closed the notebook. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the house settle around me. Somewhere upstairs, Lorraine was on the phone. I could hear the murmur of her voice through the ceiling, probably Nadine, probably planning. Let them plan, I thought. My plans were already finished. On the morning of Thursday, April 3rd, I retained an attorney. Not Dwight Sutton. A woman named Sandra Kay, whose office was on Moorhead Street in a building with no lobby fountain and no receptionist who called anyone hon. Sandra Kay had been recommended to me by Marcus Calloway, the headhunter, who had said, if you ever need someone who doesn't lose, call Sandra. She bills like a surgeon and works like one too. I'd called her on March 25th, the day after the filing. We'd spoken for 40 minutes. I'd explained the situation, the real situation, all of it. The try-on offer, the test, the filing, the family's response, and what I wanted the outcome to look like. She'd been quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "Mr. Meeks, in 22 years of family law, I have never had a client walk in holding the cards you're holding. Let's make sure we play them correctly." On April 3rd, I went to her office and signed a counterfiling. Not a response to Lorraine's terms. A complete counterproposal drafted by Sandra and reviewed by a forensic accountant named Dale Worthy at a firm on South College Street. The counterproposal was based on the actual financial picture, not the one Lorraine assumed existed. It accounted for the house, which was in my name alone. It accounted for my 401k, which was premarital in origin and partially shielded under North Carolina equitable distribution law. It accounted for the Schwab account, which Lorraine had been drawing from at a rate of approximately $2,800 per month for personal expenses she had never disclosed, a pattern Dale Worthy had documented across 14 months of statements. And it accounted for my income, which as of April 7th would be $1.2 million per year, a fact Lorraine did not yet know and which would render her proposed terms absurd by comparison. Sandra filed the counterproposal on Thursday. She timed it so that Dwight Sutton would receive it on Friday afternoon, late enough in the day that he couldn't respond before the weekend, early enough that he'd spend all of Saturday thinking about it. I drove home from Sandra's office and made dinner. Lorraine came in around 7 o'clock, carrying shopping bags from South Park Mall. She set them on the counter, didn't look at me, and went upstairs. I ate alone and washed the dishes. I checked my email. There was a final confirmation from Patricia Okafor's office. The announcement was locked. Monday, 8 a.m., simultaneous release across all channels. I spent the weekend in the study. On Saturday, I reviewed the complete Tryon National organizational chart for the third time. On Sunday, I pressed the suit I would wear on Monday, a charcoal wool I'd bought in 2019, the last time I'd needed to look like a man who ran something. I hung it on the back of the study door. Lorraine didn't come into the study. She hadn't been in that room in over a year. On Sunday evening, Celeste called. She didn't ask how I was. She said, "Dad, Parker and I talked, and we think you should probably sign Mom's proposal this week. Dragging it out just looks petty." I told her I'd think about it. She said, "There's nothing to think about, Dad. You lost your job. This is the reality now." I told her to have a good night. She hung up without saying it back. I wrote it down. This is the reality now. I underlined it twice. Monday, April 7th. I was awake at 5:15. I showered, dressed, put on the charcoal suit. I knotted a burgundy tie that I'd bought at a shop on East Trade Street. I put the leather notebook in my inside jacket pocket, where it had lived during every important day of my professional life. Lorraine was still asleep. I didn't wake her. I made coffee, drank it standing at the counter, rinsed the mug, and left the house at 6:45 a.m. I drove south on Selwyn, turned onto Moorhead, took the ramp onto I-277, and followed it to South Tryon Street. The Tryon Tower rose against a clear April sky, 32 floors of glass catching the early light. I pulled into the executive parking structure at 7:20. My name was already on the reserved space. Harold Meeks, Managing Director. The letters were white on a black placard. The paint was still fresh. I took the elevator to 14. The receptionist, a woman named Sandra who had been briefed, stood when I walked in. "Good morning, Mr. Meeks. Welcome to Tryon National." She said it the way you greet someone whose name has weight. I thanked her. She showed me to the corner office. Large desk, Carolina granite ledge below the window, a view facing east toward the sunrise. On the desk, a welcome packet, a Tryon National portfolio, and a single sheet of paper that read, "Press release goes live at 8 a.m. All channels." I sat down. I opened the notebook to a fresh page. I wrote the date. I wrote, Day 1, 14th floor. At 8 a.m., the Charlotte Business Journal published a feature. The headline read, "Tryon National names Harold Meeks as Managing Director, ending 8-month search." There was a photo of me, recent, professional, taken during the recruitment process. The article described my background in detail, 22 years U.S. Army logistics, 31 years at Kessler Brand, VP of Operations overseeing a distribution network spanning 11 states. It quoted Patricia Okafor. Harold Meeks represents exactly the kind of leadership Tryon National needs at this stage of our growth. His record speaks for itself, and we are fortunate to have him. At 8 a.m., LinkedIn carried the post from Tryon National's corporate page. Patricia Okafor shared it to her 43,000 followers with a personal endorsement. Within 2 hours, it had 1,200 reactions and 340 comments. Former colleagues, military contacts, industry connections, people I hadn't spoken to in years, all surfacing with congratulations and recognition. At 8 a.m., the Charlotte Observer ran a shorter piece in the business section. It mentioned my name, my appointment, and the $2.3 billion revenue figure. It noted that Tryon National was the largest privately held company in the state of North Carolina. At 8:45, my phone started ringing. Not from the office. From the life I had left on Selwyn Avenue. Lorraine called first. 8:47 a.m. I watched the screen light up on my desk. I let it ring through to voicemail. She called again at 8:52. Again at 9:01. Again at 9:14. For calls in 27 minutes. I didn't listen to the voicemails. I didn't need to. I knew what they said. They said, "What is happening?" They said, "Why didn't you tell me?" They said, "We need to talk." They said everything except, "I'm sorry." Celeste texted at 9:30. For messages in rapid succession. "Dad, I just saw the Charlotte Business Journal article. Why didn't you tell us about this? This changes everything. We need to talk about the settlement. Call me back, please." Parker Ainsley, the man who had offered me entry-level warehouse work, left a voicemail at 9:45. I played it once. "Hey, Dad, Harold. Just saw the news. That's incredible. Really incredible. Listen, we should get together this week. I've actually been meaning to talk to you about some investment opportunities that might be right up your alley now that you're, in a different position. Call me back." Dad. He'd finally used the word. It only took $1.2 million a year. Jerome texted at 10:15. First contact in 2 weeks. Congrats, Pop. Big moves. We should talk. Maybe dinner this week. My treat. His treat. With what money? I did not ask. I answered none of them. I set my personal phone in the desk drawer, face down, beside the leather notebook. I spent the rest of the morning in meetings with Tryon's department heads, reviewing Q1 performance, walking the 14th floor, learning the building. At noon, I ate lunch at my desk, a sandwich from the cafe on the ground floor. At 12:30, I checked the phone. 17 missed calls, 22 text messages, 3 voicemails, 2 emails. I put it back in the drawer. The world I had built in silence was now louder than anything they had to say, and I was in no hurry to turn down the volume. Lorraine came to the house that evening. I was already home. I'd left the Tryon Tower at 5:30, driven up I-277, and pulled into the driveway on Selwyn Avenue at 5:55. I changed out of the suit, put on a flannel shirt and jeans, and made a pot of coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of me and waited. She arrived at 6:40. I heard her car in the driveway. She'd been staying at Nadine's since the week prior, moving out in stages the way she moved into everything, with maximum theater and minimum efficiency. I heard the front door open. I heard her footsteps in the hallway. Then she was standing in the kitchen doorway, still in the coat she'd worn to wherever she'd been when the announcement dropped, her face carrying the specific expression of someone who has been running calculations all day and doesn't like the results. "Harold." "Lorraine." She came to the table. She didn't sit down. She stood across from me with her hands on the back of the chair, fingers gripping the wood like it was the edge of something she was trying not to fall off. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice was controlled, but the edges were fraying. "I've been calling you all day. Celeste's been calling. Your son has been calling. Nobody knows what's going on." I took a sip of coffee. "What's going on is that I started a new position today. Harold, this is the biggest company in North Carolina. You're the managing director. When did this happen? When were you offered this?" "March 14th. I watched the math register on her face. March 14th. For days before I'd told her about the layoff. 4 days before the conversation at this very table that had started the chain of events leading to a divorce filing, an asset appraisal, a staging consultation, and an Instagram post about inherited effort. She sat down. Not because she wanted to, because her legs made the decision for her. "You knew," she said. "You knew when you told me you'd been let go." "I knew. You lied to me. I told you something that wasn't true. You filed for divorce within 72 hours. I'd say the lie revealed more about you than it did about me." Her face went through 3 expressions in about 4 seconds. Shock, anger, and then the one I'd been waiting for. The one that arrives when someone realizes they've been outmaneuvered and the only person they can blame is themselves. It's a very specific look. The jaw loosens. The eyes go slightly flat. The hands stop gripping. "You tested me," she said. "I gave you an opportunity to show me who you were when the money stopped. You showed me. That's not fair, Harold. You can't just." "I can't just what? Lose my job?" "People lose their jobs, Lorraine. It happens." What doesn't usually happen is that their wife of 38 years hires a divorce attorney before the severance paperwork is even filed. "I was scared," she said. Her voice dropped half an octave, the register she used when she wanted something to sound vulnerable. "I panicked. I didn't know what we were going to do. I thought." "You thought the income was the marriage." I said it without anger, without volume, just the way you'd state a measurement. "You thought that as long as the money was coming in, you were in. And the moment it stopped, you were out. That's not panic, Lorraine. That's a business decision." She leaned forward. "We can fix this. We can pull the filing. I'll call Dwight tomorrow." "We can. You can call whoever you'd like," I said. "But I'm not pulling anything. Sandra K. filed my counterproposal on Thursday. You'll receive it through Dwight by end of week, if you haven't already." "Sandra K. You already have a lawyer." "I've had a lawyer since March 25th. The same way I've had a new job since March 14th. The same way I've had a notebook full of everything you, Celeste, Parker, Jerome, Nadine, and Glenn Driscoll have said and done over the past 2 weeks." She looked at the notebook on the table. Looked at it the way you'd look at a security camera you'd just noticed in a room you thought was private. "Harold, please. Don't do this. We have 38 years. I closed the notebook. I stood up. I looked at her across the table, across the kitchen, across 3 decades of a life I had funded, maintained, defended, and been quietly discarded from the moment she believed the funding had stopped. "We had 38 years, I said. You spent them in 72 hours. She didn't move. I walked past her, down the hall, into the study. I closed the door. I heard her sit at the table for a long time. Then I heard her leave. The next morning, I dealt with Celeste. She arrived at the house unannounced at 11 a.m., a Tuesday. I was working from home, reviewing contracts on my laptop in the study. The doorbell rang. I answered it. My daughter was standing on the porch in a blazer, her hair done, her face arranged into the expression she probably used for client presentations, professional warmth masking professional intention. "Dad, we need to talk." She walked in without being invited, the way she'd always walked into this house, as though the door was a formality. She sat down in the living room. I sat across from her. She looked at me with a version of concern that required a script. "I want you to know that I'm proud of you," she said. "This try-on thing is incredible. I've been telling everyone." Parker's thrilled. He's already talking about how this could open doors for us in the commercial insurance space, corporate accounts, that kind of thing. I let her finish. She had more. "But I also think we need to talk about the divorce. I know Mom moved fast, and I know it looks bad. But she was scared, Dad. We all were. And now that things are different, I think you should seriously consider reconciling. Not for her sake. For the family's sake." "The family," I said. "Yes." She leaned forward. "Think about holidays. Think about grandchildren someday. Think about what it looks like if this falls apart publicly. You're the managing director of Tryon National now. You need a stable family image." There it was. The real reason. Not love. Not loyalty. Not 38 years of partnership. Image. Brand. The optics of a managing director's family photo on the mantle. "Celeste," I said, "I want you to listen to me carefully, because I'm only going to say this once." She blinked. 3 weeks ago, you called me and told me to sell my house because your mother deserved it more than I did. Your husband called me and offered me entry-level warehouse work. You posted on Instagram about people who show up while I was eating dinner alone in the house I've owned for 28 years. Your mother brought a staging consultant to my home while I was sitting in the next room. Your brother called me once in 2 weeks and asked for $800. And not a single one of you, not one, asked me if I was okay. She opened her mouth. I didn't let her fill it. You didn't show up when it was hard, Celeste. You showed up when the Charlotte Business Journal told you it was worth showing up. And now you're sitting in my living room talking about family image. Dad, that's not. I held up one hand. Quiet. Just a gesture. She stopped. I'm not reconciling with your mother. I'm not selling this house. And I'm not pretending the last 2 weeks didn't happen so that you and Parker can network at my expense. Her composure cracked. Not all the way. A hairline fracture. The kind you can hear if you're listening. Her eyes went wet. Her voice got tight. So you're just cutting us off? Your own daughter? I stood up. I'm not cutting you off. I'm responding to the version of me you chose to be loyal to. You picked the one without a job. Now you're meeting the one with one. I walked to the front door and opened it. When you're ready to treat me like your father instead of your mother's accountant, you know where I live. She left. She didn't slam the door. She pulled it shut behind her with the careful restraint of someone who wanted to slam it and knew she couldn't afford to. I watched her car pull out of the driveway. I went back to the study. I opened the notebook. I wrote, Celeste, Tuesday, 11 a.m. 38 years of fatherhood, and it took a press release to get her to sit in my living room. I wrote, conversation complete. Over the next 3 days, I closed the remaining doors. Jerome called on Wednesday. I picked up. He started with Pop, which was a word he hadn't used since high school. He congratulated me. He said he wanted to come to Charlotte that weekend, take me to dinner, catch up for real. I asked him one question. When was the last time you called me without needing money? He went quiet. I let the silence hold. He said, that's fair. I said, when you figure out the answer, call me back. I hung up. Glenn Driscoll knocked on my door Thursday evening. He'd seen the article. He'd heard from someone in the neighborhood. He stood on my porch with a bottle of wine and said, Harold, my God. Try on National. I had no idea you were in the running for something like that. I took the wine. I thanked him. I said, Glenn, 2 weeks ago you offered me a recommendation letter because Lorraine told your book club I'd been fired for incompetence. I appreciate the wine, but I think we both know where we stand. He left. He didn't come back. Nadine called on Friday, through Lorraine's phone. I didn't pick up. She left a voicemail that started with, Harold, this is Nadine, and ended with, I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding and we should all sit down like adults. I deleted it. Nadine had walked through my house with a tape measure. There was nothing to misunderstand. By Sunday, April 13th, I had spoken to every person who had participated in the 2 weeks of humiliation, and I had given each of them exactly what they'd given me. A clear, honest assessment delivered without shouting, without cruelty, and without any indication that I would be available for renegotiation. I was not punishing them. I was showing them the same respect they had shown me, which was exactly none. The difference was that I did it to their faces, while they had done it behind my back. I considered that an upgrade. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday morning in June. Different times. Lorraine signed at 9 o'clock. I signed at 11 o'clock. Sandra Kay had arranged it that way without me asking. The final terms were not what Lorraine had proposed in March. They were not what Dwight Sutton had imagined when he drafted that 11-page document from his East Boulevard office with the lobby fountain. The house stayed mine. It had always been mine. The deed was in my name. The mortgage had been paid from my accounts, and Sandra had established the ownership history with the kind of documentation that doesn't leave room for interpretation. The Schwab account was split 50-50, which was fair. The 401k was partitioned according to equitable distribution guidelines, and the premarital contributions, which constituted the first 12 years of the account, were excluded from the division. Lorraine received a lump sum settlement that Sandra described as reasonable under the circumstances and generous given the conduct. There was no spousal support. Sandra had argued, persuasively, that a woman who files for divorce 3 days after a reported job loss has forfeited the presumption that the marriage was the source of her financial dependence. The judge agreed. Dwight Sutton attempted, in the final weeks of negotiation, to introduce the Tryon national salary as a basis for revisiting the terms. Sandra shut it down in a 4-page filing that cited the timeline. The divorce had been initiated by Lorraine on March 21st, based on her assessment of my financial situation at that time. The Tryon appointment, announced April 7th, was a post-separation event. The income one earned at Tryon National was not marital property. It was mine. Sutton went quiet for 3 days after receiving that filing. Then he came back with a settlement acceptance. Lorraine signed. I imagine she signed the way you sign something when you've been told by your own attorney that fighting will only make it worse. The whole thing took 40 minutes. I signed where I was supposed to sign, shook Sandra's hand, and drove to the Tryon Tower. I had a 1 o'clock meeting with the VP of Government Contracts. Life continued. I want to be clear about something. There was no moment of triumph. I didn't sit in the car and feel the weight lift. I didn't play music on the drive. I didn't call anyone. I drove to work, parked in the space with my name on it, took the elevator to 14, and sat down at a desk that overlooked a city I'd lived in for 40 years. The view was good. The coffee was better than what I'd made at home. And the afternoon was filled with work that mattered, decisions that affected real people, logistics that moved real things to real places on schedules that had to be exact. That was the day my marriage officially ended, and it felt exactly like every other Thursday, except quieter inside. What I did feel, and I'm not going to dress it up, was the specific absence of noise I hadn't realized I'd been living with. Not happiness. Not relief. Room. The kind of room that opens up when something that was quietly misaligned for a long time is finally, cleanly corrected. Like a watch that's been running 2 seconds slow for years, and you finally adjust the regulator, and the tick comes back true. Lorraine moved out fully by mid-June. She found a 2-bedroom apartment in a complex on Fairview Road, the kind of place she would have called transitional if someone else had been living there. She took what was hers. She left what was mine. The split was clean because Sandra had made it clean, and because Lorraine, to her credit, had the sense not to contest what she couldn't win. We were civil, not warm, not collaborative. Civil in the way 2 people are civil when one of them has been caught and the other has decided that catching them was enough. Celeste tried twice more in the weeks that followed. The first time was a text, long and carefully worded, about how she hoped I could see things from her perspective and how the whole situation had been confusing for everyone. I read it. I didn't respond. The second time was a card, mailed to the house, with a handwritten note that said, "I love you, Dad. I hope you know that." I read it. I put it in the desk drawer. Not because I doubted she loved me. Because love that only activates when the Charlotte Business Journal says so is not the kind of love you build a relationship on. It's the kind you frame on a wall and point to when someone asks if you have one. When she was ready to show up without a headline as the invitation, I would be here. Until then, the door was exactly where she'd left it. Parker Ainsley sent one more message, something about a business lunch, and I deleted it without reading past the subject line. Parker was not a bad person. He was an empty one, and I had no interest in filling him. Jerome called once, about a month after the announcement. He didn't ask for money. He said, "I've been thinking about what you said, and you're right. I don't remember the last time I called without needing something." There was a pause. "I'm going to work on that." I told him I appreciated him saying it. I told him I'd be here when he was ready. He said, "Okay, Pop." It was the most honest 4-minute conversation I'd had with my son in 5 years. It wasn't a reconciliation. It was a foundation. Whether he built on it was his decision. Glenn Driscoll waved from his driveway once. I waved back. That was the extent of our relationship going forward, which was exactly the extent it had always been, minus the performance. Nadine, I never spoke to again. Nadine had walked through my house with a tape measure and a friend named Diane and had discussed how to stage my life for sale. There was no conversation that could undo that. Some people you forgive. Some people you simply stop including. The house on Selwyn Avenue is quiet now. Not the temporary quiet of someone being away. The permanent quiet of a place that belongs entirely to the person living in it. I repainted the study, the same color it had always been, a deep navy that Lorraine had called oppressive, and that I have always considered the exact color a room should be when you're doing your best thinking. I put a new shelf in the study. On it, a framed photograph from 2012, a fishing trip I took with Jerome to Lake Norman when he was 19. He'd caught a bass that was, in all honesty, unremarkably small, but his face in the photo suggested he'd landed something significant. We'd both been laughing. The camera had been propped on a tackle box. Neither of us remembered who'd set the timer. Next to the photo, the leather notebook. Closed. The last entry was dated April 7th, day 1. 14th floor. I haven't opened it since. Not because I'm avoiding it. Because the thing it was tracking is finished. The test ran. The results came in. The documentation is complete. What I do with the data is the same thing I've always done with data. I file it, I learn from it, and I move forward. I still live in Charlotte. I still drive South Tryon Street to the Tryon Tower every morning. I park in the space with my name on it and take the elevator to 14. The view faces east. On clear mornings, the light comes through the glass and hits the granite ledge at an angle that makes the whole office look like it was designed specifically for the hour of 7:30 a.m. It probably wasn't, but I get there early enough to enjoy it anyway. The work is demanding. The hours are long. The decisions are consequential. I manage a company that employs 4,200 people across 6 states, that holds contracts worth more than most people will see in a lifetime, that moves the kind of freight that keeps supply chains functioning and economies running. It is, by any measure, the most important work I have ever done. And at the end of every day, I come home to a house that is exactly the way I left it. The dogwood in the backyard is blooming. The flagstone path is level. The study is dark and quiet and mine. She asked me once, near the end of the negotiations, why I hadn't just told her the truth from the start. Why the test? Why the silence? Why let it play out? I told her the truth. Because if I'd told you about Tryon the day I found out, you would have stayed. And I would have spent the rest of my life wondering whether you stayed for me or for the title. Letting it play out meant there was nothing left to wonder about. You showed me exactly who you were when you thought I had nothing. And I responded accordingly. She didn't have an answer for that. I think it was the first time she understood that the test hadn't been cruel. It had been clarifying. The cruelty was what she'd done with the opportunity. On Saturday mornings, I sit in the study with a cup of coffee and the Charlotte Observer. I read the business section first, then the sports, then the crossword. I work the crossword in pen because I've been doing it long enough to trust my answers. The notebook sits on the shelf above the desk, closed, next to the fishing photo and a pewter mug I've had for longer than I can remember. I am 65 years old. I am the managing director of the largest private company in the state of North Carolina. I live alone in a house I've owned for 28 years, on a street I know by heart, in a city that has been home for 4 decades. The people who left when they thought the lights were going out have not been invited back now that the lights are on. That's not bitterness. That's clarity. Some mornings, the sunrise through the east-facing window on the 14th floor is the kind of thing you'd photograph if you were the type. I'm not the type. I just stand there for a minute with my coffee and watch it happen. Then I sit down at the desk, open the portfolio, and get to work. The leather notebook stays in the study. The test is over. The results are filed. And the man they underestimated is exactly where he always intended to be. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions in the comments. See you soon in the next story.